Palmyra, a tropical island in the South Seas. For most of the year, it's uninhabited. But by strange coincidence, in June of 1974, 6 sailboats all converged on this tiny island. It should have been Shangri-La, but when bad blood developed, piracy took over, and the only law was the law of the jungle.
A small, uninhabited island almost 1,000 miles from nowhere. It's hard to believe such a paradise really exists. For most sailors on the South Pacific, Palmyra is a stop on the way to somewhere else. But for a few, it's a destination of its own, a place to disappear from the world. That's just what happened to Mac and Muff Graham, although it wasn't their intention. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Crime on the high seas falls under the jurisdiction of the FBI. The disappearance of the Grahams and their yacht suggested trouble in paradise. The problem was, there was not a shred of evidence to prove it.
Palmyra Atoll is a series of small islands in the South Pacific, formed by a coral reef which surrounds a lagoon. It is owned by the United States, and during World War II, it housed a U.S. Navy base. The remains of the deserted base are still on the island today. It is located approximately 1,000 miles from Hawaii and is a stopover point for sailors and yachtsmen on their way to Samoa. Oftentimes, large, beautiful sailboats can be seen at the broken-down docks in its lagoon. But on June 26, 1974, a small sailboat named the Iola made its way past the docks and into Palmyra's makeshift harbor. She had just completed a difficult 19-day journey from Hawaii, carrying a crew of 2. The boat was not suitable for the trip, and now limped into the lagoon, barely seaworthy. The ship's motor had frozen up about halfway to Palmyra. Before leaving Hawaii, the owners had repaired the Iola, which was a wooden boat, by covering it with a coat of fiberglass. The friction created by these 2 materials caused a crack to form in the hull. On the way to Palmyra, the Iola had begun to take on water. They had little money and very few provisions. Their plan was to live off the fruits of the island until later in the year. They had made a deal with some friends to bring supplies to the island, which they would exchange for a crop of marijuana they intended to grow. When they arrived at Palmyra, they were unhappy to see a handful of visitors at the dock area. They had hoped they would have the island to themselves. When they came ashore, they were greeted by a welcoming committee. It wasn't at all what they had expected. They introduced themselves as Stephanie Stearns and Roy Allen, even though the name Buck was tattooed on his right arm in plain view.
What's your name, I'm saying? Roy Allen. Roy? Yeah. Roy, you got Buck on your the side there.
When one of the yachtsmen commented on it, Stephanie claimed that Buck was his nickname. Something about Roy was different from the other yachters. He seemed rougher, perhaps even a little dangerous. Shortly after Roy and Stephanie arrived, another boat appeared in the channel, a beautiful 38-foot ketch called the Sea Wind. It wasn't long before the new arrivals made their way over to the dock. Mac Graham was 53 years old. His wife, Eleanor, nicknamed Muff, was a few years younger.
Hey, I want Mac. This is my wife, Muff.
Muff. Hi, Evelyn.
Like Roy, they were surprised to find so many people on what was supposed to be an uninhabited island where they planned to spend the better part of a year.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm Mac. Yeah? Hey, Mac, you got any cigarettes? Sure.
When Roy noticed Mac was a smoker, he asked for a cigarette and took most of the pack. This gesture would be considered impolite anywhere, but on an island, it was particularly so as supplies are limited and can't easily be replaced. For Mac and the others, this was their first insight into the kind of person Roy Allen might be. Roy also boasted about his plans to raise marijuana and trade it for supplies. Soon, everyone began settling into their new life in paradise. Muff Graham began to explore the island, the ruins of the Navy base and the sandy shores.
CQ, CQDX.
And he also made sure to keep in touch with the outside world by shortwave radio.
Everything's fine out here.
At regularly scheduled times, Mac would contact his friend Kurt Shoemaker in Hawaii and tell him about his latest discoveries.
Here's KH6IHG, Hawaii Island, calling and listening. He's just like, Tom Sawyer out in the, on the Mississippi or something. And so he would explain what he did each day. He'd go on excursions, just him, with his machete through the jungle and exploring all the things down there.
For Roy and Stephanie, on the other hand, things weren't going quite as well. Roy found the island was not well suited for growing marijuana. Living aboard the Iola was difficult. The boat was small, damp, cluttered, and cramped. Their supplies were all but gone, and they began to barter their possessions with the owners of the other boats for food and supplies. To the Grahams and the others, Roy and Stephanie were a nuisance. They were not properly supplied to be out on the high seas this far from civilization. The other yachters had enough supplies for themselves with some extra for emergencies, but not enough to supply Roy and Stephanie. The Grahams were known for their hospitality. They had invited the other visitors to Palmyra aboard the Sea Wind. Others warned them not to allow Roy and Stephanie on their boat. But Mac wanted to make an attempt at being cordial. On July 5th, 2 weeks after the Grahams arrived, and long after everyone else on the island had already had the tour of the Sea Wind, Roy and Stephanie received an invitation to visit. They eagerly accepted.
Oh, the Sea Wind was a real yacht. It was a beautiful-looking boat to begin with, and nice lines. And Mac had kept it in just perfect shape.
It's gorgeous, huh? That's
The Sea Wind was everything the Iola was not. It had a fully stocked larder, and it was equipped with every high-tech navigational device on the market. It had plenty of room, and the Sea Wind had sailed around the world. Stephanie commented on its size and human comforts. She was enchanted by the big bunk in the forward cabin. Roy remained sullen. When Roy began to find the cramped quarters and damp bedding of the Iola too confining, he decided to move into a makeshift tent on the beach. Stephanie would stay aboard the boat. By now, Roy and Stephanie had bartered most of their possessions with the other yachters for food and supplies. Other than trading or flat-out begging, they had little to do with the others. The situation was getting worse by the day. Most of the marijuana seedlings they had counted on for money had been eaten by insects. Although Palmyra has abundant natural resources, including fish, crabs, bird eggs, and coconuts, Roy had little knowledge of how to survive off the land. To catch fish, he would shoot them with his .22 caliber revolver. Like clockwork, Mac continued his weekly radio conversations with Kurt, and he kept him informed about Roy and Stephanie.
Okay.
They had moved way down the end of the lagoon and would have nothing to do with the other group. And bizarre things like they started planting marijuana again to see if they could grow it. He needed, I think they were running low on food, so he needed coconuts. He took a chainsaw and cut a coconut tree down to get to the coconuts. That's kind of stupid.
It also infuriated Muff Graham. Mac loved the island and had no tolerance for Roy's destructive
What's your
ways.
problem? You don't have to do that to get one of these. Why don't you just climb up and get it down?
One day he confronted Roy about
I didn't ask you
it.
for your
Roy
opinion
quickly
anyway.
became angry and told Mac to mind his own business. The hostility between them was building. On July 13th, Muff Graham wrote her mother a letter. She hadn't been enthusiastic about living on an island in the first place, and having Roy and Stephanie there only added to her misgivings. Dearest mother, 3 boats are here now, but one is leaving and will take this letter with them. That leaves us alone with the hippie couple who plan to stay here and live off the land. It's just our luck they decided to roost in Palmyra. Roy and Stephanie have run out of sugar, cigarettes, and I don't know what. They've bartered with other boats. Next, they will ask us. Muff sent the letter back to civilization with Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who were leaving Palmyra after a brief stay. The Grahams had previously made arrangements to receive letters over the radio from Kurt Shoemaker, who read them to Mac during their regular weekly shortwave contacts.
During that period of time, I was receiving mail from both of their mothers, his mother and hers. And then I would read this to them. Well, as one of the boats down there would leave, they would take the mail with them and eventually mail it when back in Honolulu or wherever. So there was communication going back and forth. And an interesting thing about it is one of the letters I read, the mother, and I think she was in her 80s, she says that she was afraid for them. She says, you should leave that place, something will happen to you.
One day when Mac was talking to Kurt, he told him that Roy had sent a message with one of the yachts back to his friends in Hawaii. They were supposed to bring Roy and Stephanie supplies to Palmyra, and he told his friends to reply through Kurt's shortwave radio. Mac asked him if he had heard any news from them, but Kurt had heard nothing, and when Mac talked to him about Roy and Stephanie, there was something about their description that worried him.
And in between these conversations, he had occasionally mentioned the other boat. And I told him, I said, you know, that doesn't sound too good, these people. I said, you know, you better be careful. And he said, well, no, I can take care of myself. I'll be all right. And, so I said, well, I don't know. I think you ought to get out of there myself, or one of you ought to leave.
My fault?
I don't want to hear it.
No, I don't care.
Roy and Stephanie's tempers
I
were
live in a
running
dump,
short.
that's why. Look around you.
During the first weeks of August, the sound of angry voices could frequently be heard across the lagoon. The other visitors to the island saw Roy as a violent and quick-tempered man who was dangerous and should be avoided. Then, midway through August, another boat came to Palmyra and spent a few days. Norman Sanders and Thomas Wolfe were on their way to Samoa. The night before they were set to leave, they had cocktails with Mac and Muff. The talk turned to the Iola. Sanders was a sailing expert. He told them he had offered Roy advice about getting the Iola to Samoa. He said he'd suggested Roy and Stephanie should go there, but Roy had just become angry and refused the help. Wolfe cautioned the Grahams that it would be easy for an unsuspecting couple to disappear on a place like Palmyra. In response, Mac opened a drawer and pulled out a .357 Magnum. He assured the others that he could take care of himself. I'm tougher than he is, Mac said confidently. Wolfe and Sanders left Palmyra the next day.
The group of people that were down there, the various boats, one by one, of course, were on their way somewhere, and they, one after another, left.
Visitors had come and gone pretty regularly for the last 2 months, but with the departure of Wolfe and Sanders on August 17th, things changed. This was the end of the season when most sailors would be stopping by Palmyra. Mac and Muff Graham were alone on the island with Stephanie and Roy. On August 27th, Mac talked to Kurt Shoemaker. Roy and Stephanie and the Grahams had been alone on Palmyra for 10 days. The tension between Mac and Muff Graham and Roy and Stephanie had increased. Muff knew Roy had a gun and a chainsaw, and at one point he'd been seen with an acetylene torch. This scared her and she wanted off Palmyra, but Mac stubbornly didn't want to leave. The boats had moved to opposite sides of the lagoon and the couples pretty much ignored each other. But then, something unusual happened.
Here is KH6IHG. I was talking to him, and while we're talking, he hears a female voice yelling, saying something, calling to him. And he says, "Oh, what's this company?" So he says, "Hang on a minute, I'll go topside and see." And he says, "I'll be darned. She's coming over in her dinghy, and she says she has a cake for him." And he says, "I guess they're going to declare a truce or something, huh?" That was the words he used. He says, "I better check this out carefully." I said, "Okay." So same schedule next week, same time. So I said, "Be careful now and see you later." That was it.
1 week later, Shoemaker was at his radio for their regularly scheduled conversation. For the first time since Mac and Muff had left Hawaii, there was no response from the sea wind.
I was concerned about that, and I tried for quite a while, about 20 minutes to half an hour, trying to make contact. So the next contact was a couple of days later, and then I tried again, nothing. And then for the next few weeks, I tried, intermittently from time to time. And then it was at that point that I decided something happened.
Unable to convince the authorities that something had gone wrong on Palmyra, Shoemaker had a friend fly over the island. The aerial survey seemed to confirm his worst fears. Palmyra was deserted. There were no boats in the harbor, no Iola, no sea wind, and there was no sign of life.
Well, I had a feeling that all that time that something had happened. The boat had been taken over. I was very strong feelings about that, simply because of all of the incidents that they related to me and he related, and I mean it just pointed to that one thing, but I couldn't convince anyone that that was a problem.
Shoemaker did have one resource available to him, the radio. Having no idea where they had gone, he spread the word to yachtsmen in the Pacific to be on the lookout for the sea wind. But days, weeks, and then months passed with no word about the fate of Mac and Muff Graham or the sea wind. 2 months after the last communication with the Grahams, Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who had been given the last written message from the Grahams, were at the Alawai Yacht Harbor in Hawaii. Bernard noticed a 38-foot ketch with very distinctive lines.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Well, then it had to have
It had been repainted, but Bernard was certain it was the sea wind. He also recognized a familiar figure on deck, Roy Allen. Knowing the tensions that had existed between the Grahams and Roy and Stephanie, and also knowing that the Grahams had not been heard from in some time, Leonard immediately called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard had been aware of the missing sea wind.
Yes,
When Leonard explained that the owners were not on the boat, the Coast Guard officers felt this might lead to something outside of their jurisdiction. They called the FBI. The call was answered by Special Agent Calvin Shishido, who worked out of the FBI's Hawaii field office.
My assignment there was just a general mix of general criminal investigations, security investigations, backgrounds. It was such a small office that we couldn't specialize. We had to handle everything that came at us.
Shishido agreed to meet the Coast Guard and the Leonards at the marina, although what he heard was not conclusive enough to warrant FBI involvement. Perhaps the owners were on shore, or perhaps they had sold the boat. Perhaps it wasn't even the sea wind. After arriving moments later, the Leonards showed him the yacht in question. There seemed to be no one aboard.
So he pointed out the areas where there was an attempt to disguise the boat. You know, it had been repainted, the gunnels had been repainted, the nameplate was taken off, it was removed and painted over. and other things that he pointed out to show that it was actually the sea wind. He knew it was the sea wind.
Although there was still no direct evidence of foul play, Shishido was growing suspicious. There was no visible activity on the boat, so Shishido instructed the Coast Guard officers to post a lookout. The lookout spotted Roy and Stephanie the next morning, rowing from the floating dock towards shore in a little dinghy. He immediately alerted the Coast Guard, who in turn called Special Agent Shishido. But another boat owner hailed Stephanie and Roy and told them that the Coast Guard had been looking around their boat the day before. Roy noticed a Coast Guard patrol boat in the marina that seemed to be moving towards them. Roy quickly changed direction and headed for the nearest dock. After letting Roy off, Stephanie started to row back to the sea ring. Two plainclothes policemen were approaching Roy when he spotted them. Without hesitating, he turned and dove off the end of the dock and began to swim away. The officers found a wallet on the dock.
And in it was the identification of this Roy Allen, and it had a photograph. And I believe Mr. Leonard looked at the picture and said that was Roy Allen.
Meanwhile, the Coast Guard boat had spotted Stephanie in the rowboat and began to give chase. She turned and started to row towards shore, hoping to reach the dock before they caught up with her. When she reached the dock, she jumped out and began to run, but there was nowhere for her to go. The patrol boat was right behind, with Bernard Leonard aboard. He and a Coast Guardsman followed her. They saw her dart into a hotel stairwell. They found her hiding behind a potted palm. She immediately recognized Leonard from Palmyra.
Come with us.
As the Coast Guard officer took her into custody, one question was foremost on Leonard's mind. What had happened to the Grahams? Stephanie Stearns was taken to the Coast Guard offices for questioning. On the way there, Bernard Leonard and Stephanie found themselves alone in the rowboat. When he asked if Mac and Muff were still alive, she shook her head. Mac and Muff, she told him, had apparently drowned. At least, they never found their bodies. Leonard was incredulous. How could that have happened? Stephanie explained that she and Roy had been invited to the Sea Wind for dinner, but the Grahams never showed up. The next morning, she and Roy found the Grahams' overturned inflatable Zodiac boat washed up on shore in the shark-infested lagoon. After searching fruitlessly for the bodies, they decided to take their own boat back to Hawaii, but it got hung up on the reef. So they went back and took the abandoned Sea Wind. Leonard listened to Stephanie, but he didn't believe her story.
As I remember it,
In the Coast Guard offices, she started telling her story again, this time to Special Agent Shishido and the Coast Guard.
At any time. Okay.
This is the way it happened. This is the way I'm telling it to you.
Details then of what happened to them.
At one point, I remember speaking to her. She kept going on, and I kept reminding her that she had the right to remain silent and that anything she said could be used against her in a court of law. And she would just keep on talking.
Stephanie told him she had arrived at the Seawind with Roy just about in time for dinner. The boat was strangely quiet. They called out, but no one answered.
Hello? Hello? Mac? Mom? Hello?
They went below and continued their search, but got no reply.
I can't find anybody down here.
They're not here.
Didn't you say they were gonna meet us here?
Yeah, they knew we were coming for dinner.
They assumed the Grahams had gone out fishing for dinner and made themselves at home till they returned.
There's nobody here.
According to Stephanie, the Grahams never showed up, so they both decided to spend the night on the Seawind.
All right.
They believed the Grahams would show up any time. But the next morning, when the Grahams hadn't returned, she said they became very worried and went out to look for Muff and Mac as soon as it was light. But all they found was the Grahams' overturned Zodiac washed up on shore and a can full of gasoline. They turned the inflated boat over and started the motor. Then she said they spent the next 2 days searching for the Grahams or any sign of what might have happened to them. But they found nothing. The Grahams had simply vanished. Shishido found her story implausible.
Together, and we went over there.
When she explained how they had taken possession of the Seawind, her story was quite different from the one she had just told Leonard.
No one would have believed us. They would have taken
This
the
time,
boat.
she said they had left Palmyra aboard the Seawind towing the Iola, which got caught up on a reef and sank.
And all we found
Stephanie was
the
tripping
Zodiac.
over her first lie.
And
But I knew there were at least, two conflicting stories as to how they got in possession of the boat. At this point, we became very worried about the Graham's condition. We didn't know what had happened to them, and we certainly was not going to get any real true information from Stephanie Stearns.
but
The FBI has jurisdiction over crime on the high seas. Shishido determined he had enough evidence to arrest Stephanie Stearns for interstate transportation of stolen property. Then his attention turned to Stephanie's boyfriend, Roy Allen, who had evaded the police at the marina and was still at large. Shishido checked, and there was no record of a Roy Allen, but he had the wallet with Roy Allen's picture. Bernard Leonard also told Shishido that Roy had taken marijuana plants to Palmyra and had intended to grow them to sell. Drugs and a photograph of Roy gave him a starting place.
But I suspected that people with, traveling on the Iola, which is not really a seaworthy boat, going around and planting marijuana on the islands and so on, must be involved in drug running.
Hi, Cal. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. What can I do for you today?
Shishido took the photograph to the Drug Enforcement Agency and showed it to several of the agents.
So we would like to get further information on here.
They were
Well, we do have a
surprised when they
file
looked at the
on Buck.
picture.
Let me get into it.
They
look
told him
around
that
and
it was
see what I
Buck
can get.
Walker
That's great.
and that they had been looking for him.
I'll get back to you on that. Have a good day.
Same to you.
All right.
And so we got all the background data on Buck Walker, and that's when our search for Buck Walker began. And now we're looking for Buck Walker instead of Roy Allen.
Buck Dwayne Walker was a convicted felon and a fugitive. He had been awaiting sentencing on a drug conviction when he and Stephanie fled Hawaii on the Iola headed for Palmyra. As the search for Walker began with a new urgency, Shishido was also concerned about the Grahams. He knew Stephanie was lying and changing details about what had happened on Palmyra. He didn't trust her story about the fate of the Grahams. There was always the possibility that the Grahams were alive and stranded on the island. Shishido made arrangements for himself and some other agents to travel to Palmyra to see if they could find them.
We decided to go to Palmyra to see if maybe the Grahams were stranded there, in need of food, and or they could have been tied up for all we know, and immobile, and their lives were in danger. So we decided to go out there to look around, and we did.
On the island, they found the remains of the camp Buck Walker had abandoned. They took photographs and examined the site thoroughly. A search of the island produced no sign of the Grahams. However, Shishido did make a couple of curious discoveries.
I remember picking up a hatch cover, and of course, later it was identified as a hatch cover coming off of the Iola.
The hatch cover was important because no seaman would leave for high waters without his hatch cover. Without it, the boat could take on water, which would cause it to sink. This told Shishido that Roy and Stephanie had intended to scuttle the Iola. Using these clues, Shishido began to develop his theory as to what happened to the Grahams.
My thinking was that they had tied the couple up and put them on the Iola and sank the Iola. And that was the only explanation we had because we couldn't find the Iola, and there was no way the Iola could be in Hawaii because they certainly wouldn't be sailing the Seawind and the Iola by themselves.
Shishido found something at an old Navy warehouse that piqued his interest.
I think one of the things, too, that I noticed was that in an old workshop or warehouse, there was an old air rescue boat or sea rescue boat, and it had a place for 3 containers where they put provisions. And of the 3, 2 receptacle areas were, the cans were missing, and the third was still left there. And of course, now we're looking for 2 people. In my mind, suspiciously thought that these 2 cans, because, it was large enough that they could have been, containing the remains of the couple.
Meanwhile, the search for Buck Walker continued. On November 8th, 1974, after spending 10 days hiding out on the lava flows on the big island of Hawaii, Buck resurfaced in a tiny hamlet off the beaten track. He rented a room and went to a restaurant for a drink. At the same moment, across the street, 2 uniformed officers were eating lunch. As they paid the bill, they showed their waitress a picture of Buck Walker. She said he'd just been in the restaurant looking for a drink, and she'd sent him to a bar across the street. The officers spotted him and contacted the FBI. Buck was arrested on the fugitive charge. He was read his rights and handcuffed without a struggle.
FBI, you're under arrest. Put your
Under
hands on
questioning, Buck revealed nothing that could help the investigation. He answered questions with a frank yes or no, or with stone silence. The investigators couldn't find even the slightest piece of information that could help them find the Grahams.
Right arm.
While Stephanie was in prison awaiting trial, Shishido found more proof Stephanie and Buck were lying.
While she was at prison, we found out that she had some photographs developed. So when the photographs were developed and brought back to prison, we seized the photographs and examined them. Among the photographs showed that the Seawind, or Stephanie Stearns, was on the Seawind taking a photograph of the Iola under full sail with Buck Walker on board the Iola. So we knew that at one point Stephanie was on the Seawind and Buck Walker by himself on the Iola.
This was different than the stories both Buck and Stephanie told officials. Shishido was convinced that the Grahams had been murdered. But without any bodies and no hard evidence, the U.S. attorney assigned to prosecute the case did not believe they could make a homicide charge stand up in court.
We could, but it's strictly circumstantial, and we might not win the case. And if we lose the case, and later, years later, if the bodies should pop up and we get some real good evidence as to murder on the part of the Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns, he said we couldn't try them again. So I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns were charged with interstate transportation of stolen property. It was an open and shut case. Buck and Stephanie had been caught with possession of the Seawind in Hawaii and had made numerous attempts to change its appearance. Buck had registered it under his name as a homemade boat. Buck and Stephanie were both found guilty. Buck Walker received 10 years for his previous drug conviction and 5 years for theft of the Seawind. Stephanie Stearns received 2 years for her role in the boat theft. But Shishido was still convinced the couple had killed Mac and Muff Graham, and that somewhere on or around Palmyra was the evidence to prove it. He could only hope that someday it might surface, and then he could charge Buck and Stephanie with murder. On January 21st, 1981, a young South African couple, Robert and Sharon Jordan, were visiting Palmyra. Almost 7 years had passed since Mac and Muff Graham disappeared. That afternoon, Sharon went for a walk down the beach and made a startling discovery. Washed up on the shore was an aluminum canister, and beside it, she found human bones and a skull. Around one of the bones was a wristwatch. She had heard the story of Mac and Muff Graham and immediately contacted the Coast Guard. Cal Shishido was catching up on paperwork when he overheard part of a phone conversation.
Human bones? Palmyra?
First he heard the words human bones, and then Palmyra. Where's Palmyra? The agent was new and had never heard of the case. Shishido was on his feet immediately. Who was on the phone, he asked. The agent told him it was the Coast Guard. Shishido quickly took the phone and told the Coast Guard to ask the couple who had discovered the bones to stay on the island and wait for them.
When I first heard that, of course, I was really excited because I thought, whoa, somebody found some bones on Palmyra, and it had to be the Grahams, and I thought, this is it.
Shishido and a team of investigators flew to Palmyra to examine the new findings. If the bones Sharon Jordan found belonged to either one of the Grahams, the FBI might be able to establish the cause of death. Shishido was shown the gruesome discovery: a skull, human bones, a wristwatch, and some wire, all lying next to an open metal box, identical to the kind Shishido noticed in the rescue boats on his previous visit to the island. He speculated that the wire had been wrapped around the case and had somehow come loose. Then when the case came ashore, it had opened and the bones had spilled out. Since a second container had been missing from the Navy rescue boat, Shishido felt the other victim might still be inside. Divers were sent to search the surrounding waters, looking for a container like the one found on the beach. But in the shark-infested waters, the divers found nothing. When Shishido got back to Honolulu, he sent the container, wire, skull, and bones to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. for examination. The skull belonged to a Caucasian woman in her late 40s or early 50s. Dental records showed that it was Muff Graham's. The skull also had signs of charring around the left eye socket and a hole in the left temple. The FBI concluded that the contour of the hole was consistent with a gunshot wound, but due to the age of the wound, could not say conclusively that it was caused by a bullet. The aluminum box was examined by the FBI Elemental Analysis Unit. They found evidence of charring on the outside of the box. Next, the FBI needed to determine if the skeleton had been in the box. They cut out a rectangular section and subjected it to a battery of tests. The rectangular piece of metal was found to contain traces of human protein, conclusive proof that the box had once held a body.
The FBI did a tremendous job as far as the container was concerned, because they came back with a report that indicated that there were human remains in the container, that the remains had been burned, and that while it was in flame, the container was in about 2 inches of water. And they found traces of human protein, human fabric in the container and everything, to indicate that a human body was disposed of in the container by flame.
As Shishido had suspected, Muff Graham had not simply drowned, she had been murdered. The FBI now believed it had enough evidence to prosecute Buck and Stephanie for the murder of Muff Graham. Having served her jail term for the theft of the Seawind, Stephanie now had a white-collar job in California. She was arrested and taken into custody. Buck Walker was still serving time in prison, or so Shishido thought.
When I sent our agents in the state of Washington a lead to put a detainer on Buck Walker, I found out that he was an escapee. And so I thought, oh no, not again. You know, are we going to have to do this search all over for him? We found that there was only one woman that had visited him, and that she had visited him the day before his escape.
A trace was placed on the woman, which led them to her car, parked in a motel in Yuma, Nevada. The FBI was notified and set up a stakeout. When Buck and another man came out of the motel and approached the car, the FBI moved in. He was considered an armed and dangerous fugitive, wanted both for murder and jailbreak. On the front seat of the car, they found barbiturates and several thousands of dollars in cash. Buck Walker was arrested and charged with the murder of Muff Graham. Stephanie Stearns was also arrested and charged with the same crime, though they would be tried separately. Because of the publicity the story had generated in Hawaii, the trials were moved to San Francisco. Both cases were assigned to federal prosecutor Elliot Inoki. The motive for the crime was never in doubt.
The motive was they were without a seaworthy vessel. The only other couple on the island was leaving shortly. They were running out of food, and they didn't know when any other vessel would get there, if at all, because this was becoming the end of the so-called season when you could expect people to visit the island. So you had people running out of food and provisions with an inability to get anywhere.
Inoki knew he could show Buck and Stephanie had opportunity and motive to kill the Grahams. But first he had to prove in court that Muff Graham was murdered. He also needed to completely discredit Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams had drowned. As Inoki began constructing his theory of the case, Shishido was busy putting holes in Buck and Stephanie's defense. The FBI had already found evidence of human protein on the sides of the aluminum box. But since the bones were found next to it, Inoki wanted additional proof that the body had actually been in the box. Therefore, ruling out the possibility of Muff drowning as Buck and Stephanie had claimed, he contacted San Francisco's chief medical examiner, Boyd Stevens.
Finding the skeleton together is supportive that Miss Graham was in that box and therefore held together. It's not possible for me to really say that she couldn't have stayed together if she had been out of the box. However, the problems that would be required is that the skeleton has to stay together even after it's disarticulated. And that's an extremely strong argument that could not have occurred if she had died and just been laying on the lagoon bottom. The second is that the skeleton has to come ashore together, and that's just not really possible.
Shishido also decided to test Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams' dinghy, the Zodiac, had been found overturned.
Of course, you know, later investigation showed that if the boat had capsized the way they said they found it, the outboard motor would have been inoperable because of the salt water going into the engine itself. And of course, we made a test to find out whether the Zodiac could actually tip over accidentally, and we tried to force it to turn upside down, banging into things with 3 or 4 men sitting on one edge of the boat, and it just wouldn't tip over.
Inoki also asked medical examiner Boyd Stevens to examine Muff Graham's skull in order to corroborate the FBI's findings that Muff had been murdered. Inoki knew that having two highly respected sources would strengthen his case. Stephens found flat abrasions to the skull, consistent with prolonged confinement in a box, such as the aluminum container.
The key issues for us was the flattening of the skull, which represents that it had been placed against a hard, flat surface, primarily across the left side of the face. And what I'm pointing to is the nose, the eye sockets, and what would be the cheek and life, and of course the teeth. One of the things that was evident about the skull of Miss Graham is that this whole area about the face had been planed down so that it was a flat surface. And if you can imagine, if I take this skull and put it across a flat surface, and let's just say this table is coated with sandpaper, and I work it back and forth for a period of time, eventually I would shave it down till it was a flat surface. There was a second plane showing that the skull had changed position and again had been exposed to a flat surface with motion for a long period of time. We used that as an argument that the skull had been within the box and moving. If the body had been buried in the coral sand, then it would not be a change that we would expect to see. And coffin wear is not seen if somebody's buried in dirt or in coral. It's seen if they're in a hard surface container.
There were minimal animal bite marks and insects on the skull, which were consistent with remains that had only been exposed to the surface life for a short period of time, presumably the time after the box had surfaced and opened. But what about the charring on the skull and the metal box? Did this show an attempt to destroy the body?
One of the questions we had been asked is whether we could prove that the skull had been burned with an acetylene torch.
People who were at Palmyra when Buck and Stephanie were there saw Buck with an acetylene torch. The FBI believed this is what caused the burns to the skull. If Inoki could have Stephens corroborate this, he could further implicate Walker.
If a person is exposed to a flame, there may be burning of the outer portions of the skin, but until the water is evaporated, the tissue can't burn. And it takes a heat period to boil the water off or evaporate it before the tissue can actually burn. Acetylene torches, of course, run fairly hot, and they would do that process fairly rapidly.
The marks on the skull clearly showed the use of an extreme source of heat. Further evidence that Muff had been murdered. The forensic evidence overwhelmingly proved that Muff Graham had been murdered. A trial date was set. A trial involving people who live on the high seas presents some unique challenges. The FBI had to subpoena about 40 witnesses and then make sure they were in San Francisco at the time of the trial. Special Agent Hal Marshall was assigned to the case.
I first became involved when I transferred to Honolulu in 1981 from Los Angeles. Witnesses were flying in from all over the world, literally. Sharon Jordan and her husband and 2 children came in twice from South Africa. And one of the hard situations was a lot of these people were boating people who did not keep in touch. Last we heard of some of them, they were in a bay in Hawaii in a boat with no fixed address. So it was a matter of getting them to San Francisco, sometime having to wait 2 or 3 days, sometime postponing it. Weather conditions and things like that that required us to be sure they were there when we needed them. And luckily, everybody showed up that needed to show up, and everything went smooth.
There were only 2 possible suspects, and Buck had an extensive criminal record. But did Buck commit the murder alone, or was Stephanie also involved? She was the last person known to have contact with the Grahams on the day she brought them a cake. Elliot Inoki believed Stephanie had one strong advantage on her side.
Well, she had one option. She could blame Walker. And although she didn't directly do that, her attorney certainly did in the way the case was argued and presented. That gave her a very big option that Walker simply did not have, or if he had, it was a much more difficult sell because of the circumstances and the personalities involved. He's the one with the prior record, much bigger than she is. You know, the testimony about him shooting fish with his gun. I mean, he had a lot of things on his side of the ledger that were not on her side of the ledger. One of the other substantial differences is that Stephanie testified in the case. Walker did not, and so she directly refuted any claim of knowledge or involvement in any kind of homicide. But certainly, through her testimony, left a large room for her attorney to argue that Mr. Walker had the opportunity and the means to commit a murder.
A jury found Buck Walker guilty after only a few hours of deliberations, and he received a sentence of life in prison. Stephanie Stearns was defended by famed attorney Vincent Bugliosi, who was convinced of her innocence. She was acquitted of all charges when he convinced a jury that Buck not only acted alone, but sought to conceal the crime from his girlfriend. We may never know what really happened on Palmyra on that day in late August, though the forensic evidence paints a grisly picture.
Well, empirically, I believe that that Miss Graham was killed exactly as the charge was made, and that is that she was shot, that there was an attempt to burn her body, that her extremities were probably fractured to get her into the box, and that she was cast into the ocean and then eventually came adrift. And I think that that probably happened to the husband as well.
Mac Graham's body has never been found, although investigators believe there's a very high likelihood that he's in the other box. Across the country, young men were being shot down in cold blood. The killer struck unexpectedly. His attacks were unprovoked. His sole motivation was racial hatred. And after he killed, he vanished.
When a sniper in Utah started targeting African American men for death, authorities launched a massive investigation. With scant clues and no witnesses, they found the odds stacked against them. And they had no idea where the killer would strike next. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Civil rights violations fall under federal jurisdiction, so the killings become the FBI's business. The investigation soon grew into a nationwide manhunt for a roving serial killer.
Salt Lake City, Utah. On an August night in 1980, 4 youths walked through Liberty Park enjoying the last days of their summer. 20-year-old Ted Fields and 18-year-old David Martin had just finished choir practice. Terry Elrod had just begun dating David a few weeks earlier and had set up her friend Karma Ingersoll with Ted. This was their first date. The four had met to jog in the park, but decided to walk and talk instead. They were too preoccupied with each other to notice a man watching them through the scope of his rifle. When David Martin dropped to his knees, the others thought he was joking. Then Terry felt something sting her arm, and she knew he was deadly serious. Ted told the girls to take cover while he tried to help his friend. Then he too was shot down. Police and rescue units raced to the scene. David Martin, barely alive, was rushed to the hospital, but died hours later of 3 gunshot wounds. Ted Fields, the son of a police chaplain, was dead. Witnesses told police they heard shots coming from an abandoned building across the street. But no one saw the shots fired, and no one saw the gunman. Detectives spoke with Terry Elrod at the nearby trauma center where she was being treated for her wound. She was still badly shaken, but told investigators what she could recall. When she and her friends reached the intersection, she thought she heard firecrackers. David crumpled and she felt a sting on her arm. She saw blood, then realized that David was seriously wounded. As she told her story, she recalled something that had happened a few minutes before the shooting. The group was almost hit by a car traveling the wrong way down a one-way street. But she could not identify the make, model, or license plate, and she never saw the driver. Salt Lake City Detective Don Bell didn't know why the youths were targeted.
These were young boys. They'd never been in trouble with the police. We didn't have an outstanding motive. We didn't know whether it was something related to the girls, whether something related to the boys, or just a case of mistaken identity.
In the morning, police returned to the crime scene to conduct a more thorough search. In a field across from the park, police found tire tracks. Technicians photographed and measured them. Close to the tracks, police recovered 6 bullet casings. Witnesses said they had heard the gunfire coming from the abandoned building. Now detectives believed that what they heard were the echoes. The shooter had apparently hidden in the bushes, lying in wait for the foursome to walk into range. Police matched the casings to the bullets that killed the 2 young men. They sent the evidence to the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C. to determine the type of gun the assassin used. That would take time. Investigators tried to find other leads to the killer's identity. Bell started with the family members of the victims. In particular, Terry Elrod's father seemed like a possible suspect.
You looking for me?
Teach Elrod led an outlaw biker gang and was upset that Terry was dating a black man. Detectives spent 3 days tracking him down.
So where have you been? Hanging out.
When they found him, he agreed to come in for questioning. Investigators were very thorough with him. He said he'd been on a whitewater rafting trip and that friends could back up his story.
What? I did? Just have I did? Just have a What seat. Am I, an arrest or something?
Detectives weren't convinced. They demanded Elrod take a polygraph test.
Find out right now. Have a seat.
He would pass, and his alibi was corroborated. Police had no more suspects. They returned to the Liberty Park crime scene to canvass the neighborhood. One resident, Gary Spicer, told investigators he had seen something suspicious earlier that evening. A car had parked close to his home and he went out to investigate.
Hey, yo, buddy.
He saw a man packing
Yo, man,
or
where you going
unpacking
here?
something in the trunk.
Where you going? Where you going in my neighborhood?
Spicer asked what he was doing, but the stranger simply shut the trunk and drove away. Spicer didn't see his face, but told investigators that he was a slender white man. He described the car as a Camaro with chrome mags.
Yeah.
Detectives thought the information was promising, since the car was parked close to where they had earlier found the tire tracks. 2 days after the murders, police seemed no closer to solving it. Press coverage intensified and community outrage escalated.
We'd never had a homicide like this in Salt Lake City. We had never had people just gunned down, especially young people gunned down in the middle of an intersection. The general public wanted to know about the killings. They wanted to know if they were race-related.
With the possibility of civil rights violations, concern grew in the Justice Department. Assistant U.S. Attorney Steve Snar was brought in to monitor the case.
Members of the black community were particularly concerned and were somewhat vocal about whether this was racially motivated, but at the time there were no clear answers.
FBI Special Agent Curtis Jensen from the Salt Lake City office was assigned to assist local investigators.
When I first heard about this case, I was incensed. It caused a great deal of concern among not just the black community, but all of the community in Salt Lake City. They felt that there was an assassin loose and it could happen again.
As community pressure grew, test results from the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C. offered investigators a fresh lead. Examiners determined that the weapon had been a 6-shot rifle, either a Marlin or Glenfield .30-30. After searching gun shops and classified ads for recent purchases, investigators assembled 150 weapons that matched the description. They tested each one. None had fired the bullets found at the scene. By now, it was likely that the assailant had fled the area and perhaps the state. So the FBI sent out nationwide teletypes to local and federal agencies describing details of the crime, including the weapon and shell casings. With still no suspects, a $50,000 reward was offered to promote the public's help. Calls flooded in. All were checked, none panned out. Most who came forward were after the money and had nothing solid to offer. But one showed a hint of promise. A young woman claimed she might have met the killer. She identified herself as Mickey, a part-time prostitute. She was reluctant to talk to police until Detective Bell assured her she wouldn't be charged if she came in for an interview.
She was actually a struggling college student, and so she would go out 2 days a week and work on one of the streets that a lot of the prostitutes worked on.
She told the detective about a man she had met sometime in August, close to the time of the killings. Mickey was walking down the street when a man in a Camaro pulled up and asked if she wanted to party. She hadn't planned on turning any tricks that day, so she said no. He said he'd make it worth her while. She relented since she needed the money and the man didn't seem threatening. He spoke with a southern accent and introduced himself as Bill Hagman. He drove her to the Regal Inn Motel.
Just getting ready to go.
In the room, Mickey noticed that Hagman had weapons. She described 2 long guns that stood in the corner and 1 silver handgun. Hagman didn't talk about them, and Mickey was afraid to ask. She also said that the man had tattoos on both arms. On his left forearm was an American eagle, on the right, the Grim Reaper. After their stay at the motel, Hagman offered to treat her to lunch, then drive her home. At an intersection on the way to the restaurant, he pulled out his handgun and said something she would never forget.
Who's with this guy?
He explained that he was a contract hitman for the Ku Klux Klan and said, "Do you want me to kill those niggers?" She says, put the gun away. She was very concerned about what he was going to do. He then says, it's real easy. I've done work like this before. You just walk up, you shoot him, you walk on. Everybody's concerned with him falling. No one pays any attention to you.
Mickey was terrified, but was able to talk him out of killing the pedestrian. Afterward, Hagman dropped her at her apartment, where he briefly met her roommate. Bell wondered if Mickey was reliable, or just another false witness looking for the reward money. Even if her story was true, Hagman's role in the case was unclear.
Did it have anything to do with our killing, or was this just a bad guy that was blowing through town and trying to, make this part-time hooker be impressed with his ability of being a hitman or something?
If Mickey could identify the long guns she saw in the motel room, her story would have more weight, especially if she identified them as either a Glenfield or Marlin rifle, which the FBI had determined to be the murder weapon. Mickey told Bell she didn't know much about firearms and didn't look at the weapons for very long.
All right, if I had to pick, it was
The detective insisted she try.
in the room. If I had to
But the guns she chose from the photos didn't match either murder weapon. Mickey's story seemed like another dead end. Despite his doubts, Bell made an appointment for her and her roommate to come back and work with a police sketch artist. Meanwhile, investigators continued to pursue the hundreds of leads that poured in. Public pressure was mounting. The community feared that the sniper could strike again, and police didn't know that he already had. 3 weeks after the double murder of 2 young black men in Salt Lake City, the killer's identity remained unknown. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. Local authorities received a response to the national telex sent by the FBI. Police in Cincinnati were investigating a similar unsolved double murder that happened 2 months earlier. On a late evening in June 1980, 13-year-old Dante Brown and 14-year-old Darrell Lane walked to the candy store close to their homes. They never saw the man watching them. Danger struck quickly. They didn't have a chance. Cincinnati police raced to the scene. They found Darrell Lane dead. Dante was still alive, but in serious condition. Both boys had been shot twice. Officers talked to onlookers, hoping someone had seen something, but no one had. Detective Mike O'Brien of the Cincinnati Police recalls that the coroner provided investigators with their first clue.
The coroner responded to the scene, and he had already performed a post-mortem examination on one of the young men and was able to tell the trajectory and the direction the shots were fired in.
The coroner pointed them towards the train trestle 75 feet away. Police combed the trestle. Among the overgrowth, they recovered 4 spent rifle casings. Ballistics analysts determined that they were shot from a .44 Ruger carbine rifle. Months had passed since the double murder in Cincinnati, and detectives had no suspects. No one knew why someone would want to kill the teenagers.
This wasn't the typical homicide. When you have 2 children, 13, 14-year-old children that are shot, sniper-style shooting with no clear motive, 2 children on their way to a candy store. It obviously had the city and the neighborhood in an uproar.
When O'Brien heard about the Salt Lake City sniper, he invited the detectives to Cincinnati to compare the cases more closely. To Salt Lake City Detective Bell, the connection was significant. It revealed a breed of killer not encountered before 1980.
Once we were made aware of this information, we were pretty much convinced that we were dealing with the same killer from back east. And this was actually our real first involvement with what is commonly now referred to as a traveling serial killer. This was a new concept to everybody, not just out in Salt Lake. It was a new concept anywhere in the country that killers would just travel across the country.
While police from both states met in Cincinnati to search for answers, Detective Bell in Salt Lake City followed up on the slim lead from the prostitute named Mickey. She told him that she'd spent time with a man named Bill Hagman at the Regal Inn Motel. He carried guns and drove a Camaro like one described by witnesses close to the crime scene. At the motel, Bell found a registration card signed by Hagman and dated August 16th, 4 days before the murders. The address Hagman listed was in Kentucky.
We had the FBI run the name through their entire database. They had nothing on that name. So we felt fairly confident that everything he'd put on this registration slip was fraudulent.
FBI labs in Washington, D.C. dusted the card for latent fingerprints, but found none. They also analyzed Hagman's handwriting and noted some unique characteristics that would make it easy to identify. They had no proof he was the killer, but he was the only lead they had. Although it was a long shot, a team of 20 detectives spread out to search other motels in the area. They carried copies of Hagman's Regal Inn registration card, hoping to match his handwriting in the event he used a different alias. Agent Jensen recalls the extensive search.
And they conducted a search of all motel rooms from Ogden, which is 30 miles north of Salt Lake, to Provo, which is 30 miles south. And they located about 8 motels where this individual had stayed using false names, each one different, using phony addresses, and using false license numbers for his car.
Local investigators also discovered the suspect had stayed at the Scenic Motel on August 20th, the day of the murders. It was just 9 blocks from the shootings in Liberty Park. Though Hagman used different names at each motel, the FBI labs confirmed the handwriting was the same. One of the cards yielded a fingerprint. But a check in the National Fingerprint Database turned up nothing.
Is this one of your motel registrations?
At the Sandman Motel, they got another break.
Help me out for a second.
Detectives discovered that his registration card listed a Camaro with its license plate number.
Okay, now, I see a license number.
But a second license number was written in the margin by the motel's owner.
Yes, I do. I wrote that number there. That's the correct number.
He must have been in his late 70s, early 80s. He went out every night around 3 o'clock in the morning and would take all of his motel registration slips and walk by all the cars and check their license plate numbers against what were put on the cards, because he was so sure that his guests were going to steal a pillow or a pillowcase.
When the owner checked the plates on Hagman's Camaro against his registration, the numbers didn't match. So he recorded the correct Kentucky plates in the margin of the card. A DMV search revealed the license plate and the Camaro were registered to a member of a prominent Louisville, Kentucky family. The Salt Lake City detectives shared their discovery with detectives in Cincinnati.
They immediately responded to Louisville and made contact with the police agency there and tracked down the actual registered owner of this car. He had in fact sold the car to another person some months before.
The Louisville man showed detectives the sales receipt. Police took down the name of the purchaser, the car's mileage, and its brand of tires. But their troubles weren't over. The purchaser had used a false name. The seller worked with a police sketch artist to render a composite of the buyer, a slender white man with a Kentucky accent. Back in Salt Lake City, Mickey and her roommate were also providing detectives with a composite sketch of the man who called himself Hagman.
At the same time, I met with Mickey, the part-time hook, and her roommate was actually an artist, a student that was studying art, and she did a freehand drawing to begin with. And then we asked her if she could work with our composite, and she did. And she put together a composite of this man.
Hey, Ron, how's it going?
How you doing, Mark?
All right. What do you got?
When the composite drawing from Louisville arrived in Utah, detectives compared the two renderings.
Good morning, Mark.
They were remarkably similar. Investigators now had the face of the suspected serial killer. Investigators hunted a serial killer who had murdered 2 young African Americans in Cincinnati and 2 more in Salt Lake City. They now had a sketch of their suspect, but lead detective Don Bell still had no name and no hard evidence connecting him with the murders.
We didn't have anything to charge him with. However, we did find a motel that he stayed here in Salt Lake for 2 nights. Since he left without paying, we immediately applied for a warrant, which was granted, and we charged him with defrauding an innkeeper or failure to pay. We issued that warrant under every single name that had been found on every single motel registration card.
The FBI entered the warrant, the license plate, and all of his aliases into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a computer database that links over 57,000 law agencies nationwide. On September 25, 1980, over a month after the Salt Lake City murders, the FBI database paid off. When officers in Boone County, Kentucky arrived at a local motel to arrest a pair of jewelry thieves, the manager told them that one of his patrons was complaining about the lights and noise from their vehicles.
7, 8 police cars in the parking lot with the red lights going and the radios blaring, and another person living in this motel took offense at being disturbed by all this noise and called the manager's office and said, "What are the cops doing there, and how come it's so noisy, and you know, I'm going to leave if you don't quiet down." And so the manager went out and approached one of the Boone County officials and said, "You know, my tenant is really upset that you're causing all this trouble."
When the sergeant asked who was complaining, the night manager told them that the calls were coming from room 80. Perturbed, the sergeant ran the license plate of the Camaro registered for the man in that room. The computer check, tied into the FBI database, turned up the warrant from Utah. Boone County sheriffs went to room 80. A slender, white male with a southern accent answered the door. Inside, officers saw 2 shotguns on the bed. They cuffed him and brought him in for questioning. This time, the fugitive registered with his real name, Joseph Paul Franklin. They notified Salt Lake City investigators that they had their man. Detective Bell and his colleague were on the next plane to Kentucky. But when they arrived, Boone County sheriffs had alarming news. The fugitive had escaped from his low-security room.
At some time during the interview, the detective briefly leaves the room to get something to drink for this subject and himself, and it's at that point that this individual makes his escape out the window and is gone.
Investigators still held his Camaro, his weapons, and wallet containing his driver's license and photo. Salt Lake City Detective Bell recalled how closely the photo matched the 2 composites.
Looking at that license, it was almost eerie. It almost looked like that the composite that had been built in Kentucky and the composite that I built out here in Salt Lake, that we had done it using Joseph Paul Franklin's driver's license.
the suspected serial killer was still one step ahead. The FBI issued a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution.
One was killed right at the scene.
Investigators hoped the resources of the FBI could stop the killer before he struck again. The fugitive's face and description flooded the media nationwide. Agent Jensen spearheaded the manhunt for the FBI.
He was almost immediately put on the 10 most wanted list because of the notoriety and because of the seriousness of the crime, the fact that he was a suspect not only in this crime, but in the assassination of a number of black people all across the United States. These were cases that hadn't been solved.
To make the most wanted fugitives list, Franklin's file was reviewed among hundreds of others. Special agents at FBI headquarters decide the 10 most wanted based on a suspect's immediate danger to society, that the suspect won't stop killing until he's caught. News of the killer's escape brought a flurry of sightings, including one from a Kentucky teenager. He said a man had offered him $100 to take him across the river to a shopping mall in Cincinnati. Investigators swarmed the mall to interview anyone who thought they'd seen him. They discovered the suspected serial killer had purchased new clothes and had his hair cut and dyed. Franklin had changed his appearance and still had a source of cash. Back in Kentucky, evidence technicians scoured the Camaro for clues. They took photos of its tires, hoping to match them with tread marks found near the crime scene in Salt Lake City. They matched. For Detective Bell, it was a major breakthrough.
The tires were sort of a new prototype that were only being released east of the Mississippi. So for tires to show in a dirt field in Salt Lake City, they would have had to have been purchased at that time east of the Mississippi. That placed that car with that man in our city.
At the FBI ballistics lab in Washington, D.C., examiners analyzed the weapons Franklin had left behind. They hoped to determine that one of the guns was the murder weapon.
He had 2 rifles and 2 handguns. The FBI was able to compare the ballistics of these weapons with the bullets that were recovered from the victims' bodies. These did not match.
The FBI also searched the NCIC database for criminal records and outstanding warrants for Joseph Paul Franklin. They discovered that Franklin had legally changed his name.
I have some more information. What do you got?
His birth name was James Clayton Vaughn. The information allowed investigators to dig more deeply into his past.
Yep.
Joseph Paul Franklin, a suspected serial killer targeting African-American men, had escaped from police in Kentucky and was still on the run. The FBI had determined that he changed his name from James Clayton Vaughn. Agents and local detectives traced his history to his hometown in Birdtown, Alabama. They spoke with people who knew him. For Cincinnati detective Mike O'Brien, a clearer picture of the fugitive started to emerge.
Birdtown is described as basically one side of the track is black and the other side is white. And so there was a lot of racial tension in his upbringing. There was a lot of problems between whites and blacks in that area. His mother had relatives that had been in World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. Franklin, at one point, had said he had read Mein Kampf and was very impressed with this writing.
Joseph Paul Franklin had selected his new name to honor one of his heroes, Hitler's chief propagandist, Paul Joseph Goebbels. The FBI tracked his movements over the previous year and found that they coincided with several unsolved bank robberies.
That's him. That's him.
Agents also learned that 2 years earlier, he had sent a letter threatening to kill President Jimmy Carter because of his pro-civil rights views. The president was currently campaigning in the South, where Franklin had last been spotted. The election was just weeks away. If Franklin was going to make good on his threat, it would be soon. Detective Bell remembers that the FBI and Secret Service rushed into action.
Well, they decided that Joseph Paul Franklin, also James Clayton Vaughn, was definitely a threat to President Carter because he had written that he would like to kill him. So they passed pictures of Joseph Paul Franklin in every city that the president was going to visit.
The FBI had to get to Franklin before Franklin got to the president.
We were able to, through contacting his friends, determine that during the process of his flight, he was selling his blood plasma to obtain money to live on. And as a result of that, we sent bulletins out to all of the blood plasma centers in the southeastern part of the United States.
Clinics across the South received packets from the FBI with information on the killer, now suspected of murder in at least 7 states.
Miss Jackson, are you okay?
I'm just so dizzy.
Okay, well, lay down there for a minute. It's going to take just a few minutes to...
On October 28th, Franklin entered a clinic in the Tampa area to sell his plasma. The technician prepping him recognized the tattoos from the FBI packet, the Grim Reaper and the American Eagle.
Is this your first time giving blood?
Oh my gosh, I'm so dizzy. Yeah.
Franklin figured selling his blood was safer than robbery for a man on the run.
I do it all the time.
He was wrong.
There is?
The technician phoned the number the FBI provided.
Yeah, okay, great. I'll keep you busy.
Federal agents surrounded the clinic and moved in to arrest Franklin. This time, there would be no mistakes.
Just wait. You have the right to remain silent.
The killer went quietly without a fight.
In court of law.
Franklin was taken to Salt Lake City to stand trial for the murders of Ted Fields and David Martin. But Detective Bell suddenly found the entire homicide case in jeopardy.
The county attorney didn't feel that we had a strong enough case. It was purely circumstantial as far as he was concerned, and he wasn't willing to go to court on just a purely circumstantial case. But the federal government, through the FBI, decided to step in at that time, and they felt that they had a very good, strong case to bring civil rights violations against him.
The civil rights conviction would present obstacles of its own. Prosecutors would have to prove not only that he had committed the homicides in Utah, but that he was motivated out of racial hatred. The FBI held suspected serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin in Salt Lake City, while federal prosecutors built a case to prove his murders were racially motivated. Agents re-interviewed his associates, family, and 2 ex-wives in order to get a clearer picture of Franklin's racial beliefs. Agent Jensen sent his team to Franklin's hometown of Birdtown, Alabama.
We were able to go back and meet with people that knew him, and we were able to develop a history of him, if you will, as to what he was like, the fact that he had been associated with the Ku Klux Klan. He'd been associated with the American Nazi Party. The fact that he'd been arrested a number of times for disorderly conduct, and in some instances because he possessed a weapon.
Prosecutors pursued witnesses who could testify to Franklin's whereabouts and his racist views. At one motel, a manager agreed to speak at trial about his encounter with Franklin.
The police had found a motel where he had stayed before the shooting took place, and he'd gone and registered in the office, and then he went to the room, pulled down the covers, and found a black hair in the bed. This upset him greatly, and so he became irate, went back to the office and yelled and screamed and made a number of racial statements against black people.
Wherever they went, investigators found witnesses who remembered Franklin's car. Assistant U.S. Attorney Steve Snar recalls that Franklin's Camaro proved crucial to his case.
The car that Mr. Franklin was driving was unique. It had a unique color. It had red pinstriping that was a custom kind of striping. It also had unique interior features and non-standard tires and other features that were noticeable to various witnesses who had observed the car in the Salt Lake area.
And he pulled up and asked
The investigative team also interviewed 2 young women who had ridden in Franklin's Camaro.
We came up with 2 girls, a lady by the name of Sandra and another one by the name of Rhonda, who actually at 4 o'clock, 4:30, 4:45 on the day of the killing, were hitchhiking a couple of blocks away from the park. This man in the Camaro picked them up, and they needed to get to the downtown bank to deposit their paycheck before it closed at 5.
As they got in the car, Franklin asked them if black people hung out in the park. One of the girls, who was dating a black man, said yes. Before he dropped them off, he handed them printed cards that said, "Take off your clothes." Bell sent the cards to the FBI lab, and examiners were able to conclusively match them to similar cards found in the glove compartment of Franklin's Camaro. The timing of the women's story was also compelling.
They actually saw him again that night, a block and a half away from the park at 8:30. So little by little, we're putting him almost in the park at the same time the victims were.
At the Salt Lake County Jail, Franklin was held in a double lockup since he had previously escaped from police custody.
Close 3.
While there, he became friendly with Robert Herrera, an inmate serving time for burglary. Herrera had more recently been disciplined for brawling with a black inmate. Although the fight was not racially motivated, Franklin assumed Herrera held the same hatred of African Americans. He looked to Herrera as a confidant. Agent Jensen recalls the importance of this relationship.
He told Herrera, he confessed to Herrera that he had shot the 2 joggers in Salt Lake City, and also confessed to a homicide in Oklahoma City.
Herrera arranged a meeting with the FBI and local investigators. He had a proposition for them.
How's it going?
Herrera would become a federal witness against Franklin if the state would guarantee his early release. Franklin told Herrera why he shot the couples in Liberty Park. He said he believed people of different races should never mix. When Franklin saw the black men walking with white girls in the park, he felt they should die. Investigators were not convinced they could trust Herrera. A confession to a convict would not ensure a successful prosecution.
You know, we've got one phone for 2 people. We have to coordinate out here too.
When investigators requested more information, Herrera told them about Franklin's whereabouts following the Salt Lake City murders.
Well, I can tell you what he did after the shootings. He did the shootings, he left here, he went north to a town north of Salt Lake, Ogden. He took the freeway across Nevada through Winnemucca, Battle Mountain, Reno, and into San Francisco, and he sold the rifle that he killed the kids at a flea market outside of the Bay Area.
Agents and local investigators needed to confirm Herrera's story. If they could find the rifle Franklin had used in Liberty Park, investigators would have the piece they were missing. Detective Bell sent his team to the flea market outside San Francisco. They interviewed gun dealers and other witnesses.
So they saturated the flea market, and they did come up with witnesses who remembered Joseph Paul Franklin and remembered that he was selling guns. But we could never find the gun.
Even without the weapon, Herrera's story was confirmed. Franklin's movements following the murders would be critical for the prosecution.
Well, this was pretty good information because we'd never been able, the FBI, ourselves, no one had ever been able to find out where Mr. Franklin had gone after doing the killing.
After agents corroborated his story, they met with Herrera again. He told investigators about other crimes Franklin confessed to. Franklin admitted shooting hustler publisher Larry Flint, crippling him in 1977 for portraying black men with white women in his magazine. Franklin also said he shot Vernon Jordan, the president of the National Urban League, in May of 1980. Federal prosecutors felt they had enough to bring the civil rights case to trial.
Well, the prosecution was an involved prosecution involving 65 witnesses and approximately 100 different exhibits. However, we managed to expedite the case and move things along in telling our story and recreating the actions and things that took place. The trial lasted 5.5 days and we were done.
The jury deliberated just 5 hours, finding Joseph Paul Franklin guilty of the federal civil rights violations. The judge sentenced him to 2 life terms. Franklin was furious that he was going to prison for the rest of his life, but more so because an African-American prosecutor helped put him there. In a rage, Franklin jumped out of his chair and threw water on the attorney. He was quickly subdued by the marshals and carted away. In an interview following his sentencing, Franklin finally admitted to investigators what motivated the killings in Utah and across the country.
He said himself that he is a racist, that he had a plan to assassinate as many blacks as he could. This was his whole purpose.
After the successful federal trial, the Salt Lake County prosecutor felt he could win a state homicide case against Franklin. Franklin was escorted to the courthouse where he had spent the last 2 months during the federal trial. During a recess, he was left unattended in a holding room. Before the court officer returned, he freed himself and pried the door off its hinges. Franklin had escaped.
No one knew how he had escaped from the holding cell. But when the jailers went to bring him back into court before the jury came in, he wasn't in the conference room.
Jeff! Jeff! It looked as if Joseph Paul Franklin was free once again to continue his path of terror. The elevator was his only way out, and only operable with a guard's key. But a marshal found the control panel dismantled. Franklin had hot-wired it using only a dime and a paper clip.
He was able to take the plate off the elevator, the prisoner elevator, and strip the wires and call the elevator to that floor. And then he disappeared.
Police closed off the streets as jailers searched the courthouse for the fugitive.
The rest of us, we immediately put out an area-wide alert that this man had escaped, and we brought every available officer there was scouring the downtown area. At the same time, the jailer decided that maybe he noticed that the top panel on the elevator had been loosened. So he climbed up on top of the elevator and noticed some movement in the dust and thought, well, somehow he's in this building. So that particular jailer started crawling every single air duct in the courthouse.
He found him. Franklin scurried like a rat in the ductwork, always remaining out of his reach. But when Franklin came to the end of the duct, a second guard was waiting.
Got your bracelets right here.
Yeah, well.
He was back in custody within an hour.
That's it. Get him out of here.
We cleaned him off and combed his hair and brought him back in. And the jury was none the wiser. They just got an extra hour for lunch.
Over his next 17 years in prison, Franklin confessed to 16 murders in 8 states. In all that time, he never admitted to the double homicide in Cincinnati. Detective Mike O'Brien never gave up. He continued to build his case, hoping to convict Franklin of the Cincinnati murders. O'Brien's break came when he was able to convince Franklin to interview with Melissa Powers, an assistant district attorney from Cincinnati.
The minute that Mr. Franklin walked in the room and sat down, and Miss Powers introduced herself, told him who she was, why she was there, he said, "You know I did it. I killed those 2 kids in Cincinnati," immediately as he sat down, which was what I've been trying to get him to do for some 17 years. He did in a matter of about 30 seconds.
In 1998, Franklin received 2 more life sentences for the Cincinnati murders. In Missouri, he was sentenced to death for 2 others. Franklin would never have another opportunity to escape. Detective Don Bell remained haunted by Franklin's rampage of violence.
I don't understand this type of killer, that he would actually just take a complete stranger, and because of their race and who they were standing by or talking to, he would feel it necessary to kill him. He's one of those few people that I just have absolutely no explanation for, and it's still hard for me to understand.
For the families of Franklin's victims, peace had finally come. Franklin would never be free to kill again. A young man vanishes without a trace. Concern turns to terror when the ransom calls begin. Police and the FBI battle a brutal drug cartel, uncovering a deadly crime ring that will do anything to get what they want.
Chicago street gang thought they had figured out how to kidnap people for ransom again and again and never get caught. But their one mistake was they underestimated the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents teamed up with one of the victim's brave relatives to break the ruthless gang who destroyed lives for profit.
June 27th, 1996, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 90 miles north of Chicago on the western shore of Lake Michigan. "17-year-old high school senior Jaime Estrada and his cousin Roberto Alvarez pulled up outside a convenience store on the city's south side. Jaime went in for sodas, leaving Roberto in the custom Monte Carlo Jaime and his brothers owned.
So what's going on tonight?
The store was a popular hangout where they often met friends. When Jaime came out, he spotted a girl he recognized. Jaime had been wanting to get to know the girl more and went to talk with her. Star catcher in local baseball leagues, Jaime was a popular kid. As Roberto was talking with a friend, he noticed the van pull away. He figured Jaime had left with the girl and would probably be right back. Jaime had not returned after more than an hour. Roberto began to worry. Something was wrong. So Roberto decided to see if Jaime had gone home. He told Jaime's brother, Paulo, what had happened and found he had not come home.
What's going on? ¿Qué pasa? Says that Jaime's been missing for an hour.
No one had heard from him since he left. It was not like Jaime to run off, leaving his cousin and his car. His parents tried to figure out what to do.
And then I've been waiting there for an hour. He still hasn't come back.
Let's go look for your brother right now.
They decided to split up and look for him in separate cars.
Go to the other hangout in Chicago. No.
His mother stayed home in case Jaime called. The family searched the area for hours. Then, Jaime's oldest brother, Mark, received a page. The area code was 312 Chicago. After the phone number was 187, Jaime's personal code. Then, 911. It was an emergency. Mark stopped at the first phone booth he saw. He hoped Jaime was all right. A man answered, a voice he did not recognize. He said they had kidnapped Jaime and wanted $70,000 for his return. The man said they were serious and warned that if the family did not follow instructions, they would cut off Jaime's ears, skin him, and send body parts in the mail. And if anyone went to the police, they would kill Jaime and the entire Estrada family. Mark was in disbelief. He called the number again. Maybe it was a prank. No one answered.
I didn't hear from anybody.
Jaime's father returned home. His wife said no one called. They were all getting frantic. When Mark came back, he told them about the call, the kidnapping, the threats. Mr. Estrada wanted to call the police immediately, but Mark told them the kidnappers would torture Jaime. They'd kill him.
We should do this.
We can't go to the
Gotta
police.
call
They
the police.
said if we go to the police, that they're gonna cut off his ears, they're gonna skin him, and they're gonna mail it to us.
The family did not know what to do.
Take him back to the kitchen.
They struggled with the decision all night, waiting for another phone call. But none came.
We're not waiting anymore.
By dawn, Mr. Estrada could wait no longer. He needed to help his son.
We need to do something. We got to call the police.
It had been more than 9 hours since Jaime was last seen. Mr. Estrada decided that he and Mark would go to the police. They had to take the chance. At the Milwaukee Police 2nd District Station,
Oh, yeah, the area code.
Mark and his father explained what happened to a detective on the Violent Crime Squad.
I called them and they said that if we went to the police, that they would cut off his ears.
Since this was an armed abduction that crossed state lines from Wisconsin to Illinois, the police called in the FBI.
Get the duty agent.
Thanks. Okay,
At the Milwaukee field office, FBI Special Agent Dan Kraft had just arrived at work.
I was sitting at my desk and I received a call. An 18-year-old kid had been kidnapped.
Kraft had to act quickly.
I met with the victim's father and his older brother, and tried to take a detailed interview of them based on what had happened, when it had happened, potentially why. I realized that this was going to become a major case.
Back at the Estrada house,
Why, who is this?
Jaime's brother Paulo answered the phone.
Who is this?
Brother.
It was the kidnappers. The man on the phone changed the ransom to $30,000 and also wanted the Monte Carlo.
What are you talking about?
He said they could prove their threats were serious. They had shot Jaime. Jaime confirmed he was shot.
Jaime!
He was hurt, bad. He pleaded with his brother to hurry.
Yeah? Jaime!
Still, the man gave no details for a ransom drop. The man said they'd call again on Paulo's cell phone.
Hello? Hello? They shot Jaime.
They shot him?
They want $30,000.
Paulo told the others the terrifying news.
Come on in, have a seat over here.
Paulo met his father and brother Mark at the FBI office.
What we're trying to do is take control of this situation.
Agents immediately tapped Paulo's cell phone since the kidnappers said they would be calling it next.
Make sure you push this down. It'll automatically start the recording before you answer the phone.
They also attached a recording device and tracing system to the Estrada's home telephone.
First thing you need to know is that this is the only phone that's going to work with.
As the FBI continued to set up, they kept interviewing the family, not wasting a second in gathering information.
One of the first things that we did was set up what we call a rapid start. It's a computer database that helps us to manage a major case. We utilized rapid start to put in all the information that we had received at this point. Every little data point that we would come up with, even if it was partial.
The sophisticated database helps track leads and find links in complex, quickly moving cases.
I'll drop off the United States. Okay. There's the phone. Don't answer it yet.
That afternoon, Paulo's phone rang.
Real quick.
He knew to try to get as much information as possible.
Keep them on the phone as long as you can. Go ahead.
Hello.
The caller asked if Paulo had the ransom.
The money.
No. Paulo said he had about half
Well,
and
yeah.
needed more
No,
time.
the drop is going to go perfect as scheduled. Jaime?
Jaime came on the phone and told his brother to hurry. He was bleeding.
Tell your brother stop dragging it out. Tell your brother stop changing plans on us, eh?
Don't worry, we're coming to get you. We're doing everything we can. You're gonna be okay, all right?
You better have it, bro.
Hello? They hung up.
That should help.
While agents and detectives tried to trace the number, the Estradas moved to an adjacent room to wait for more calls. In a kidnapping case, the FBI tries to move deliberately, but not hastily.
And we have a tendency to try to slow things down and work at our pace and try to control. When a victim is shot, now you're dealing with a life and death matter, and every minute, every moment becomes critical.
3 hours later, Paulo got another call. Special Agent Kraft was concerned about how Paulo would handle it.
These type of situations are extremely stressful to begin with. When you factor in a person who is a relative who loves the victim, cares about the victim, they're going to act on emotions every time, and they can make bad judgments.
But despite the threats to his wounded brother, Paulo remained calm. The kidnappers insisted Paulo make the ransom drop of the car and cash at a fast food restaurant in Chicago. They said they'd call back with more details.
They hung up.
You never want to introduce a civilian into a high-risk situation.
I think we should go now.
But agents had no choice. Paulo would have to drop the car off himself. But since he would need a ride back home, an undercover agent could pose as a friend to provide at least some protection for Paulo.
Be escorting you out to the site.
The team left for Chicago. Milwaukee agents called in their counterparts at the Chicago FBI field office. Special Agent Kevin Cassidy would take the lead in that city.
Immediately after that notification from Milwaukee, when we knew the agents were coming, we started to organize our squad. And we knew that this was going to be a fast-moving case where we needed to be able to quickly mobilize our resources.
The drive from Milwaukee would take an hour and a half. That gave Chicago agents time to prepare. Violent Crime Squad Supervisory Special Agent Ron Hosko set up a command post at a local sports arena.
We gathered a number of folks up on the west side of the city by the United Center in a parking lot and briefed everybody on what we understood was the situation with the kidnapping demands.
Everybody's going to be on.
United Center is centrally located, which gave agents greater flexibility for quickly getting almost anywhere in the city.
The perimeters. Let us know spots that we can set up our team, all right?
As Paulo and Special Agent Kraft traveled to the meeting place, Kraft used the time to prepare Paulo for how to handle the next call from the kidnappers.
I would coach him and practice with him. I would act as a kidnapper and fire things at him, and I could see how he would react, and I could, make suggestions to him. Well, you don't want to do that, or you want to stay away from certain areas, or draw them out more by asking specific questions.
Paulo and Kraft finally arrived at the staging area. Surveillance agents had already checked the fast food restaurant, the site of the ransom drop. The place was far from a controlled environment.
And our concerns were that there was a lot of traffic, foot traffic, pedestrian traffic, not only into the fast food shop, but in the area. And with the threats that we'd already received, we had concerns about our ability to prevent any kind of violent act with respect to the public who might be in that area at the wrong time.
But Paulo and the agents were ready. They had the money and the car.
Yeah. And one other thing, don't get out of your vehicle till the SUV is in position. All right?
Paulo got another call. Agents had him try to change the drop site to one that would be safer for everyone. But it was important he did not appear adamant.
The longer we, in effect, negotiate through the victim's brother, the more suspicious the subjects become that there's some law enforcement involvement. Ultimately, the discussions between the victim's brother and the kidnappers resulted in their agreeing to have this exchange at a department store parking lot that was a few miles away from the original location.
The kidnappers ordered Paulo to leave the money in the Monte Carlo with the doors unlocked and the keys in the ignition. Once they had the ransom and were safely away, they would allow Jaime to call Paulo to tell him where he was. Agents left right away to set up at the parking lot. It was an ideal location for protecting the public, but not Paulo. Agents would need to be hidden at a distance around the perimeter. It was Paulo who would have to face the kidnappers up close. But getting his little brother back was worth the risk. In 1996, Chicago agents and detectives were trying to rescue kidnapping victim Jaime Estrada. But the kidnappers would not bring their victim to the site of the ransom drop, according to FBI Special Agent Dan Kraft.
What we generally will try to do is have an exchange, an even exchange, the victim and the money for an even exchange. In this particular case, the kidnappers would not do that. It was not negotiable. It was not something I was very comfortable with, but sometimes you have to bend a little bit to get your ultimate goal.
The kidnappers ordered Jaime's brother Paulo to leave $30,000 in the Estrada brothers' custom Monte Carlo in a deserted parking lot. But the area was not entirely deserted. Surveillance units were hidden nearby, watching. Nearly 27 hours had passed since Jaime was abducted. Almost a full day since he was shot. Since Jaime needed medical attention, agents could not afford the time it might take to follow subjects or risk losing them. So they decided to arrest the kidnappers when the ransom drop was made. Unfortunately, the size of the location chosen by the kidnappers would make the arrest difficult to pull off. FBI Special Agent Ron Hosco.
This was a big, fairly expansive parking lot that was empty. Our vehicles were, from a starting point, on the outside of that lot, trying to maintain a discreet surveillance. So they had a fair amount of open ground that they had to cross to get in there.
Agents planned to counter this problem by attempting to keep the kidnappers off balance.
And they wanted the car left with the keys in the ignition and the doors unlocked. Well, we were going to screw that up a little bit by having the victim's brother lock the doors to the car, because it would end up stunning the kidnappers ever so slightly to where now they will have to regroup, reevaluate the situation, come up with a different plan.
We have 2 subjects in the target vehicle.
After a few minutes, a gray sedan pulled in. It looked like there were 3 men inside.
One of them got out, went over to the car, looked in, could see that the money was sitting on the front seat, so you could almost see him with joy and this desire. And then he goes to open up the door, and he can't get the door open, and the keys to the car are in the vehicle, because he didn't know what to do. So they go from being in control to now they have to react. We wanted to throw them off their game, and it swings the control back over to us.
All units, go, go, go!
The takedown signal was given. All units began to converge. But the suspects reacted instantly.
They immediately accelerated away from us before the other surveillance units had an opportunity to close the net on them.
Someone in the car pointed a gun at an agent, then threw something out of the window.
They were weaving around the responding vehicles, who are properly hesitant to ram that vehicle for any number of good reasons, not the least of which is that the victim could have been in the trunk.
The suspects got on an expressway and tore off toward downtown. Despite the late hour, there was still civilian traffic in danger.
We reached speeds of 120 miles an hour, and the kidnappers were in this stolen vehicle, and they were trying to cause an accident by going from one shoulder across 4 or 5 lanes of traffic all the way over to another shoulder, cutting cars off.
All right, Cherokee, come on up alongside of them. We're going to take them down.
Agents used their training to end the pursuit.
And they were able to execute what we call the pit maneuver, whereby they actually bumped the rear quarter panel. And the vehicle did not lose control completely. It just swerved slightly, but it was enough for the driver to slow down to a much lower speed, and our vehicles basically boxed them in at that point, and they came to a complete stop.
On the highway, agents and detectives surrounded the car. They knew the men inside were armed and dangerous.
We still had great concern about weapons, and while we could have a perimeter, you cannot prevent subjects from doing something you may not expect, like engaging in gunfire.
removed all of the occupants of the car. We ended up finding 3 subjects in the car.
They all claimed to know nothing about Jaime Estrada and wouldn't even give agents their names. Each had ammunition, but no guns.
Keep them still.
Once they had the 3 men safely in custody, investigators checked to see if anything or anyone was in the trunk. It was empty. Jaime was not with them.
And it was certainly our suspicion that at least one co-conspirator was with Jaime Estrada, that was still holding him, and we needed to identify who that person was and where they were, and do that quickly.
Agents ran the license plate number and searched the rest of the car, and discovered a knife and a night vision rifle scope. They also found several pagers, a cell phone, and a piece of cardboard with Paulo's cell phone number written on it. On the roadside near the start of the pursuit, agents located a loaded 9mm semi-automatic handgun, likely the object seen thrown from the suspect's car. At the Chicago field office, agents tried to interview each of the suspects individually.
There's a gang after us, man. I see no.
They refused to cooperate.
When's the last time you saw a gang with lights and sirens?
We stopped them, bitch.
During the interviews, the suspects' pagers went off multiple times. Someone was desperately trying to get in touch with them.
Take a look at that number. You know whose number this is.
The men swore they did not recognize the numbers.
Yeah, sure it is. What are you trying to hide? Look at these numbers.
The investigators were sure it was the rest of the group trying to find out what happened. So they tried tracing that number.
But it was an unpublished number, and the phone company would not give us the address. We pleaded with the phone company and promised them that we would give them a subpoena, but it's logistically impossible on a Friday night at 11 o'clock to try to get a judge to sign a court order.
What do I have to do to give you these numbers?
It had been a full day since the teenager was shot. Agents were frustrated that while Jaime was probably dying, a subpoena stood in their way.
I tried to plead, man to man, father to father. I said, what if it was your child? Wouldn't you want law enforcement to do everything humanly possible? And he just basically said, I don't care. We absolutely swore to him that, trust us, with the FBI, we will get you the subpoena.
FBI? Could I please speak to a supervisor?
And they said, without a subpoena, we're not going to give you the information.
The night ended with no lead on where Jaime was. The next afternoon, on the city's west side, someone dumped a body. While Chicago investigators struggled to find kidnapping victim Jaime Estrada, passers-by discovered a badly wounded man lying in the street on the city's west side.
Chicago emergency, Okendo.
The Chicago 911 operator took the emergency call and immediately dispatched patrol units and an ambulance.
Okay, does anybody...
Paramedics advised Illinois Masonic Hospital they were bringing in a man with a gunshot wound. He identified himself as Jaime Estrada. A Cook County Sheriff's investigator arrived at the hospital. The 17-year-old was not only alive, he was still conscious. The investigator asked the doctor in charge if he could talk with Jaime.
Cook County Sheriff's Office, and wondering if I could have
He said Jaime needed immediate surgery, but since the OR was still being prepared, there was time for a quick interview if Jaime agreed.
Okay, just a couple minutes.
He said he could do it.
Okay.
Can you tell me a little bit about what happened?
Went in a convenience store to get some drinks.
He said 2 nights before, he'd gone to talk to a girl he liked. He didn't know her well. While they were talking, the driver pulled a gun. It happened so quickly. He said it felt like they drove for about 2 hours. Several armed men beat him. He could not ID them. FBI Special Agent Kevin Cassidy.
Jaime did not provide any real detail regarding the identifying features of his kidnappers due to the fact he was blindfolded.
Jaime remembered passing 3 toll booths. He told the investigator that about 15 minutes after the 3rd toll booth, the van stopped. The men hustled him into a house or an apartment, he wasn't sure which.
It's your brother, man!
There they roughed him up some more, yelling about the money he owed them for the drugs.
I'll kill you, bro. I'll kill you! Huh?
He tried to tell them they had the wrong guy. That was the wrong thing to say.
You know what I'm saying, man? I'll kill you, bro. I'll kill you! Just give me the number. What's the number, S.A.? Run. Yo, get this guy! Alright. Beat him senseless.
They demanded the phone numbers to all of his family members.
What?
Huh? I got the number. 414-555-7577.
Get this guy blown out of here.
The men carefully avoided speaking their own names, but there were others who did.
During the time he was held there, he heard female voices, and he also heard one of those voices referred to a subject as Beto.
Jaime believed it was Beto that guarded him most of the time. Sometime the next morning, Jaime was just getting to sleep. Suddenly,
Beto, ¿qué pasó?
it took him a minute to realize he'd been shot.
Miguel, get them, cállate, cállate.
It even surprised some of the kidnappers. They promptly moved Jaime to a bathroom.
You'll be okay. Cállate, you'll be okay, man.
Golly!
Hey, man, you'll be okay.
Go.
Hey, man. Hey, look, you're gonna be okay, all right? Here.
Yo,
Put this
Monique,
on here.
go ahead,
Hold this right here, okay? You're gonna be okay, man.
Go, vente, get the car, bro. Beto,
All right.
come on, man, get out of here. God, Dios mío, man. He's not gonna be fine. You're gonna be all right, man.
He fell in and out of consciousness, so his memory was fuzzy. He remembered a white tile floor, a red toilet seat, maybe a red shower curtain. That was all. Jaime's gunshot wound had gone untreated for 2 days and was badly infected. He needed so many surgeries that doctors had to put him into a drug-induced coma so he could survive the ordeal. Doctors were surprised at the young man's strength, that he had survived this long. But their prognosis was not good. Several suspects were still at large. Meanwhile, on Newland Avenue in northern Chicago, a resident heard a commotion and saw what looked like two armed men forcing two others toward a van. The captives broke loose and ran. The Jaime Estrada kidnapping case was about to become much more complicated. The same day, kidnapping victim Jaime Estrada was found. A man in northern Chicago saw what appeared to be a double kidnapping outside his house on Newland Avenue. The victims managed to escape. The resident contacted Chicago police, and emergency operators sent patrol officers to the scene.
32, 25, okay. Right off of Belmont. All right, stay inside the house. Just letting you know the police are being dispatched as we speak.
I was walking home, and
Dispatch asked the officers to transport the two victims to Chicago PD's Area 5 to be interviewed by FBI Special Agent Kevin Cassidy.
Next thing you know, this van pulled in front of me.
One of them, Pedro Montoya, explained how he'd been abducted. A week earlier, he was outside his house when a van pulled up. Several men jumped out with guns and forced him inside. The other man, Chavo Rodriguez, had the same story.
They were basically grabbed off the street and forcibly put into a blue and white van.
Special Agent Cassidy remembered that Jaime was also kidnapped in a blue and white van. He decided to show Montoya and Rodriguez mugshots of the men arrested in connection with Estrada's abduction.
Both victims immediately responded that those were the same individuals that had kidnapped them.
And there were two others, the armed men they escaped from.
We then started to interview them in greater detail.
They said they were held in the basement of a house with a third man.
all right, just spin them around and put them on the post there.
They were all bound to metal poles. Each of their families were called with demands for ransom money and cars. For more than a week, the kidnappers barely fed the men. A diabetic, Rodriguez was affected most. Without his medication, his blood sugar rose, which could have rendered him unconscious or even killed him. Investigators suspected that Jaime was not the third man. He said he had been held in a bathroom, not a basement. So they showed the men his photo. Investigators were right. It wasn't him.
Did he escape with you at the same time?
They said the day before, the third man managed to escape by breaking through the duct tape that held him.
He freed himself.
They never saw him again and did not know who he was. When the kidnappers realized the third man had escaped, they tried moving Rodriguez and Montoya out of the house.
Come here. Get out of here.
It was then that the men escaped. When asked why they may have been singled out to be kidnapped and held for ransom,
I'll be here holding back something.
neither man had an answer.
But consider yourselves lucky that you made it out.
Agents obtained a federal search warrant for the Newland Avenue house where Rodriguez and Montoya were held. They collected duct tape bindings, hairs, clothing fibers, and dozens of fingerprints. The bathroom in the house did not match the description given by Jaime Estrada. Investigators believed he'd been held at a different location. Agents also recovered a Norenko assault rifle from the house.
a firearms expert determined that the bullet that was recovered from Jaime was consistent with one that would have been shot through the Norinco rifle.
In one of the bedrooms, agents found an envelope with a Los Angeles address. Inside were several photographs of a man holding the same Norinco rifle.
We took those photographs and put them into an appropriate photo array. We showed that photo array to several of the victims of the kidnappings, and they identified that as the subject that was involved in their kidnapping.
Now agents had the face of one of the two fugitives, but still no names. Agents then received information from running the kidnappers' license plates.
Our investigation led us to find an address in Chicago that was associated with the vehicle. We then had agents go to that residence.
FBI agents, man?
Agents spoke to Adalia Francisco. She reluctantly agreed to be interviewed. After persistent questioning, Mrs. Francisco told agents that her husband, Ricardo, was in hiding, having escaped from a band of kidnappers.
I don't know what to do.
Well, they kidnapped your husband?
Yes. They called here and...
Investigators determined he was the third man held in the Newland Avenue home.
And they just won't stop. I don't know what to do.
Pressed further, she explained why her husband and the other men were being held.
And the last one was the sedan that you're asking.
Further investigation and intensive interviews led us to determine that there was a nexus to illegal drug activity in each one of these individual kidnappings.
Friends of Ricardo Francisco revealed that he was a drug runner. He owed a drug cartel $100,000. Montoya owed $130,000 to the same drug cartel. Rodriguez was not involved in dealing drugs himself. It was his son. But that did not matter to the cartel.
His son had owed some money, and they grabbed the dad. In the case of Jaime Estrada, our investigation did not reveal any involvement in illegal drug activity, and we do not believe he had any.
It seemed the cartel had been duped by the girl who lured Jaime into the van. Informants identified her as Juanita Gonzalez.
The true subject in this case was the girl. She was the one that had ripped off these guys from a kilo of cocaine, and then she tried to save her own hide by laying it off on an innocent person. She just blamed it on Jaime, who was just innocent in all of this.
All Jaime's family could do was pray he'd make it through surgery. But 17-year-old Jaime Estrada could not hold on. Infection eventually killed him. This had now become a case of murder. After conducting extensive interviews in the Newland Avenue neighborhood, agents finally identified the three men already in custody as Salome Varela, Jesus Ruiz, and Miguel Torres. The man in the photograph was identified as Jose de la Paz Sanchez. The final suspect was known only as Beto. They were still at large, wanted not only for kidnapping, but for murder. In 1996, Chicago area investigators captured 3 alleged members of a kidnapping ring that took the life of 17-year-old Jaime Estrada. They still had 3 suspects to find. FBI Special Agent Kevin Cassidy had the name of one of the fugitives, Jose Sanchez. His photo was discovered in an envelope during a crime scene search.
The envelope had an address in Los Angeles. We then surmised that the subject had fled the area, and it would be logical to look for him in Los Angeles. We obtained an arrest warrant, and we forwarded that information to our Los Angeles office.
In L.A., FBI Special Agent Scott Hanley set out to apprehend Sanchez.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks. Well, good luck to you. Bye.
We went out to the location, which was a house in the Echo Park area of Los Angeles. After we'd been on the house for over 3 hours, one of the team observed a male Hispanic individual walk out of the house. But at that time, because of the distance away from him, we couldn't tell if it was Mr. Sanchez or not. We were able to follow him for approximately about a half hour on 3 different freeways in Los Angeles till he finally went to the West Los Angeles area.
The man parked outside a home improvement store. Even with a photograph of the suspect, they still could not tell if it was Sanchez.
If you've never met the person before and all you have is a photograph, you're trying to look at a real person to match it up with a photograph, and who knows how old that can be.
From the photo, they knew Sanchez had a Grim Reaper tattoo on his right upper arm.
One of the officers went in on foot to try to get a closer look of the individual. He followed this person in the store. I saw this tattoo of the Grim Reaper.
It was a positive ID. Agents were getting closer to nabbing the 4th suspect in Jaime Estrada's kidnapping and murder. In the end, it was surprisingly simple. Sanchez had been handcuffed before he realized what was happening. He was unarmed and arrested without incident. Sanchez confessed to taking part in Jaime Estrada's kidnapping and was present after Jaime had been shot.
When Mr. Sanchez admitted that he knew that Mr. Estrada had been shot, I asked him, well, you know, what was the condition of the boy? And he said, well, you know, he was talking to us. And I said, well, what did he ask? And he said, well, he asked, can I take him to the hospital? And I said, well, why didn't you do that? And he said, well, I didn't know what to do.
He also admitted to the other kidnappings and said they had been ordered by a drug cartel as a way to collect money owed to them.
Request that your lawyer be present before you answer any further questions.
Chicago investigators then began to intensify their search for the man known only as Beto. They conducted dozens of interviews with associates of the 3 men already in custody. They revealed that Beto had a sister, Monique Jimenez. Facing accessory charges, she cooperated.
Do you know anybody named Beto?
She said Beto's real name was Luis Carreno.
Have you been back?
The sister was able to describe some of the circumstances of Jaime's kidnapping, particularly the shooting. She advised that she was in the apartment at the time and had heard the shot and saw Jaime shot. And she advised that the person that shot him was in fact her brother.
There was blood there, so I had to go back.
She said she had cleaned blood off the bathroom floor with bleach. She gave the FBI the address of the apartment.
Yes, it's 2532 Moody Avenue.
An evidence response team processed the apartment, collecting samples, including the grout between the bathroom floor tiles. Lab examiners later discovered traces of blood in the grout. DNA testing proved the blood was Jaime's. In October 1997, federal prosecutors in Chicago tied the complex case together for a jury. The 4 suspects in custody, Salome Varela, Jesus Ruiz, Miguel Torres, and Jose Sanchez, were found guilty of racketeering, conspiracy, weapons violations, assault charges, and all 4 kidnappings. They were all sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The FBI tracked Juanita Gonzalez, the girl responsible for Jaime's abduction, to Mexico, where she completely disappeared. They are still looking for fugitive Luis Carreno, the man known as Beto.
He is currently wanted, and there's an outstanding arrest warrant for him. And we are working with Interpol and our other friends in foreign countries to attempt to locate him to this day, and we will continue to do so.
The Estradas pray that someday soon, the authorities will find Carreno, the man the FBI suspects killed Jaime. For the family and for the investigators who worked so hard to save Jaime, the case will never be over until everyone responsible for his death is brought to justice.